Next up, I did have that committed to memory, yes, is Jeremy Wyatt, who's going to give us a presentation about computable biomedical knowledge, what it is, how it's used, benefits, risks, and workshop scope.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to everyone for coming along today, and particularly to the steering group for the meeting for all their help. I think we've been planning this meeting since March or April, when both Philip and myself had a note from Chuck Freeman in the States saying he'd be really excited if the UK was to start some activity as a counterpart to the work that's been going on in the States for about 2 or 3 years now. That's the Mobilising Computerised knowledge activity. So maybe I should say a little bit about myself. So I'm a lapsed physician. I haven't seen patients for about 15 years, I'm afraid. And that's partly because after 5 years full-time clinical medicine, I started working in, well, even then we called it AI medicine. Brilliant, done. I ended up as chair of the European Society for AI Medicine. This is back in the late 80s. For about 10 years, ending in the late 90s, and I ran the first randomized trial on decision support in the UK, actually in Europe, back in the mid-80s. So really, I just wanted to talk about knowledge challenges and what our aim and objectives is, and then talk a little bit more about the scope of the workshop, what we mean by knowledge and the kinds of knowledge that we want to cover, and also why this workshop is important. So the NHS already uses computable knowledge in many different ways. It may sound like a trendy new thing, but in fact, e-prescribing systems, risk calculators, GP checklists, etc., those are all embedded computable knowledge. Many of these are of really high quality. I mentioned the QRISK-2 algorithm, for example. It's a really high quality algorithm, but some implementations of that are not always been of best quality, and I'll see that in a moment. And that's led to 8 recent serious incidents involving computable knowledge in the NHS, raising questions about how we manage it, and that's exactly what this workshop is about. In addition, the widening range of NHS providers means, or puts extra pressure on the need for a shared common knowledge base and care standards. I mentioned the QRISK-2 algorithm, really excellent algorithm. Unfortunately, it was applied in a different GP system, and it wasn't connected correctly to the coded data set, so it's an interoperability problem, and it ended up giving incorrect advice for between 2 and 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of consultations affected. We don't yet know quite what the consequences of that has been. It should, of course, have been checked in its implementation. Its accuracy should have been checked. And that should have then been part of the application for a CE mark. Those implementations have been CE marked and checked now. So what's the vision, looking beyond that kind of local UK problem we've had, what's the vision of the US MCBK coalition? Well, it's about producing an indexed knowledge object library, perhaps one for every specialty, or one for every country, potentially even a federation of these knowledge libraries globally. And the library will obviously include a whole range of generic facilities like security facilities, potentially charging and payment systems for those who contribute knowledge to the library, and then a host, probably eventually millions of knowledge objects. So these will be fragments of knowledge, if you like, or self-contained pieces of knowledge with some metadata, and I won't go through that in detail, and then the knowledge payloads. That might be the algorithm for QRISK-2, it might be a list of data items that we need to collect for every patient with diabetes when we see them in primary care. It could be anything. It could be rules, it could be scoring systems, etc. And obviously there will be many, many of those. And those would then be available through some kind of index system and search engine to a whole range of knowledge systems, which I've listed, some of which are on the right. Some of which, for example, like medical devices, say an insulin syringe for diabetics, or medical robots, could potentially be using this knowledge without human intervention. And you can begin to see that that then becomes fairly critical, that this knowledge is of quite good quality. So where might the knowledge come from? At the moment, they're envisaging a whole range of different sources. For example, when you submit a paper describing an algorithm to a journal, the Learning Health Systems journal, which Chuck Friedman edits, now accepts a computable version of that algorithm, and that could go into the knowledge object library. Or it could be data mining for learning health systems, could be a computable guideline, a whole range of different sources. And obviously there needs to be some filters and process around quality assurance for this knowledge. So that's the vision of the MCBK coalition. So turning to our objectives, our aim and objectives today, you've seen this slide already, but what we wanted to do was to support a variety of UK organisations across all sectors, really, professional, arm's length bodies, regulators, suppliers, people working out of the NHS, to realise the benefits of computable knowledge. And promoting networking, well, that's part of the reason for the workshop, discussing some core principles that could govern a UK-wide activity in this space, a prioritised list of issues, and this is actions and discussion for this afternoon largely. If we can identify suitable host organisations, resources, potentially even funding sources, that would be great. And then thinking about what do we need to do if we think this is a good idea, how do we take it forward? And who would like to take forward different activities? And Philip, fortunately, is editor of the BMJ Health and Care Informatics Journal and has kindly agreed to take short articles from those who are speaking today, and potentially other articles, if people have them, about this whole topic area, and publish that, and that'll help. So I could stop there, but I think it's useful just to explore what we mean by computable knowledge and the scope of the workshop in a bit more detail. And starting with information, Claude Shannon defined it as the commodity that reduces uncertainty. More recently, Ted Shortliff, one of the founders of our field, has talked about information being organised data and knowledge used to inform decisions, which I find a very helpful definition. And he distinguishes it between data and knowledge. And if we think about the spectrum of information that's specific to one patient, like, for example, a lab test result or a patient's symptom, versus information that could apply to every patient, for example, information about their anatomy or about diseases in general. And if we think about patient data item, someone's blood sugar is 7.5 millimoles, slightly elevated, that's specific to that patient. If you know that about Mrs. Smith, it doesn't tell you anything about Mrs. Jones. Whereas there's other kinds of information, for example, that diabetes is caused by insulin deficiency. Well, that only applies to some diabetics. It doesn't apply to all diabetics. But the fact that there are two kinds, possibly three, according to your reading of the literature, kinds of diabetes, that pretty well applies to everyone. Doesn't mean to say that person that you're thinking about has diabetes, but that's just general, that is knowledge. And so we can draw a line around those two kinds, and those are the kind of general information that's applicable across patients, and is the focus of this workshop. So that's what we mean here by knowledge. There are other definitions of knowledge, I hasten to say, and patient data is not really in scope except as far as it applies to interoperability, perhaps. But we're not talking about data management, we're talking about knowledge management. If you look up knowledge in the dictionary, it particularly talks about people, information about a subject you get from experience and so on. If you think about knowledge for machines, so artificial intelligence, robots, etc., Alan Newell in his presidential address came up with a very helpful definition here, the property of intelligent agents that allows them to reach their goals efficiently. And I've talked about information that can be applied across many patients in various articles in the past. Where does knowledge come from? Yes, it does come from patient care and data capture, generating records which can be analysed to yield evidence, and then assembled to yield knowledge. For example, the kind of activity that NICE carries out, doing systematic reviews of evidence from primary studies, blending in some knowledge about what's feasible in the NHS, ethics, health economics, and so on, to come up with a practice guideline. The trouble with knowledge, though, is that it can just sit on a website. It doesn't actually do anything until you access it or apply it, and therefore improve patient care. So that, to me, is the core cycle of information in healthcare and explains where knowledge differs from data, the kind of data we see in records. We also need to distinguish explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. I've already kind of implied that there are different kinds of knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the knowledge that we can write down, represent in computer systems, and communicate without ambiguity. It's about learning by reading. But there's another kind of knowledge, and in my private life, I make jewelry out of titanium. And I can kind of explain to you how I do that, but it would be a bit of a challenge, I think, for you to make a necklace like that just from me explaining it to you. I'd have to show you in my workshop how I do these things. That's tacit knowledge. It's intuitive. It can only be transferred through experience and over a period of apprenticeship. And of course, that's how medicine used to be 500 years ago. But thanks to research, we've been able to understand the expertise of those early physicians and represent it more explicitly now. So explicit knowledge is what we're talking about today. Tacit knowledge, although important, hugely important, particularly for that caring role that Hadley mentioned, isn't within scope today. And then finally, there's the domain of the knowledge. There's many places where knowledge is used around the NHS by clinicians and by informatics people, by managers, by finance people, many different areas of expertise across the NHS. But for the moment, we're talking about biomedical knowledge. So that's knowledge about medicine and also knowledge about health systems, how they're organized, how to get things done, safety, quality improvement, clinical governance, who does what in a health system. The final filter, if you like, on our scope is knowledge in computer systems. We can represent knowledge just as words for humans to read. And if you look at the web, that's what you're more or less seeing. You're looking at materials designed for humans to read and understand. And that is knowledge, but it's not represented in a format that the computer can understand and execute. But it is possible, and we'll see examples of that later, and particularly after lunch, to represent knowledge in a computer executable form or computable form. Easier to say computable than computer executable. And that allows the computer to carry out calculations, interpret lab tests, give alerts and reminders, etc., etc. And that is the final scope constraint on what we're talking about in the workshop. It's computable knowledge we're talking about, not just computer-based text. And here's a short example extracted from a nice pathway on gestational diabetes. You can see the human readable text here, and here is my very lay attempt to represent in the sequel dialect a part of that. And you can see that it's not immediately intuitively obvious to humans what that means, but it's sufficiently unambiguous for a computer to follow, as long as you've got the right libraries associated with that. There's many different ways, and there isn't time to go through all of these, that such computable knowledge can help problems that the NHS is approaching. You know, people forget things, particularly 3 o'clock in the morning. Problems with drug dosing, poor clinician vigilance, multitasking. A lot of the investigations that we order on the NHS, particularly as you get into genomes, are extraordinarily complex. Even interpreting simple ECGs isn't straightforward. Poor adherence to evidence or policy, we know that there is an issue there. And certainly around staff shortages. Currently, only 10% of clinicians posts are unfilled, but it's increasing. And variations in practice. All of these problems faced by the NHS can be ameliorated, let's not say solved, by computable knowledge. But there are a whole range of challenges. We've got a whole talk about this after lunch, so I won't go through all of these. But even simple things apparently like selecting the best knowledge object for your patient today, making sure that highly evidenced objects are prioritized over people's opinions or the results of a small audit. That's a challenge. So finally, to remind you about the scope of the workshop, it's about knowledge, not data. It's about explicit knowledge, not tacit knowledge of intuition, even though that's really important. It's not computable. It's about biomedical knowledge, not knowledge about other areas relevant to healthcare. Again, knowledge about informatics, about management, about finance is hugely important to the NHS, but not currently within scope of this activity. And it's about computer executable knowledge or computable knowledge, not computer-based knowledge, i.e. computer-based text. Just a small advert here for the Faculty of Clinical Informatics Special Interest Group on AI, which I'm currently convening. Our launch meeting will be on the 4th of December at the College of General Practice, just across the road here, and there's more detail about that on the FCI website. I don't know if there's any time for any questions or comments, or fact perhaps, rather than general discussion. 2 minutes.
Hi, Kieran Mulch, my name. I'm from B&J. Thanks for an excellent talk. What you describe as tacit knowledge, I think I might describe as a skill,
Yes.
or of a procedural skill. And I wonder how knowledge therefore fits together with skills, and can we divide them?
Yes, it's a very good question. What I usually say when people say, well, why are you emphasizing explicit rather than tacit knowledge when you say that tacit knowledge is hugely important in healthcare? And it really is. I mean, procedural skills such as carrying out a lumbar puncture or carrying out a piece of operation, or actually just having a difficult conversation with a patient or their family, communicating bad news. Those are clearly very, very crucial skills for clinicians. Having said that, though, those are the kind of skills that are currently highly regulated. The GMC inspects medical schools, and medical schools examine their students on the basis of those procedural skills. Same with the Royal Colleges. So a lot of what happens in those examinations is actually, yes, there's some examination of the facts that people know, but a lot more is about your attitudes, your skills and abilities to handle difficult situations. So in many ways, medicine is lucky that the tacit knowledge side of things is actually quite well managed already. But explicit knowledge is huge in volume and more difficult to manage. Does that answer your question a bit?
It does, thank you.
Charles, were you wanting to ask a question? No. The URL. We're going to make these slides available somewhere. I'm not quite sure where. At least I'm happy to make my slides available. I don't know anybody else. Any other points, or should we move on?